The War of Three Popes, power, betrayal, and the struggle for the papacy. In the fading light of a late summer afternoon in 1377, a murky tension wrapped itself around the papal city of Avignon. Though the sun's rays still glimmered upon the Rhône, there seemed no warmth in the corridors of the Grand Palais des Papes. Whispers broke the hush that day, urgent and filled with trepidation, for Pope Gregory XI, who had brought the papacy back from Avignon to Rome in January of that same year, was said to be gravely ill. Cardinals huddled in dim chambers, worried about the uncertain future. They all knew that the next chapter of the Church's leadership could define Christendom for decades, perhaps centuries to come. A group of cardinals stood around a circular table scattered with parchments bearing official seals, personal letters, and secret communications. The man at the head, tall and broad-shouldered, was Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly, whose alert eyes flickered with a quick intelligence. His voice, low and urgent, broke the silence. "We must consider the mood of the Roman people," he said, glancing at his colleagues. Gregory XI's decision to abandon Avignon and settle once more in Rome could be undone if his successor is not chosen carefully. We must be prepared. Around him the rustle of robes reverberated in the cavernous space. Another voice, belonging to Cardinal Robert of Geneva, who would soon become embroiled in a future no one yet imagined, cleared his throat and spoke in a more measured tone. "The Roman populace is restless. Urban, pious though he may be, has his supporters, but the Italians clamour for a Roman pope. They do not want more French dominance over the papacy." Cardinal Orsini, an Italian, gave a tight nod. "We have not had a Roman or even an Italian pope in decades. The people feel that the papacy has been hijacked by French interests. If we ignore their anger, we do so at our peril." It was an old conflict, one that had simmered since 1309 when Pope Clement V, under the influence of King Philip IV of France, had moved the papal court to Avignon. The Avignon papacy, comfortable though it was for the cardinals, most of whom were French, had drawn accusations from every corner of Christendom. The papacy was too subservient to French interests. Over the years, the outcry grew. The anger of those who saw Rome as the true seat of St. Peter's successors smouldered like a dormant volcano. And now, with Gregory XI's final illness, that volcano was poised to erupt. The news soon arrived in black vestments and hushed footsteps. Gregory XI died on March 27, 1378. Within hours, the rumour mills of Rome were ablaze. The eternal city roiled with tension and excitement none could escape. A new pope would soon be elected, and the people insisted it must be an Italian. So the cardinals, who had travelled with Gregory XI to Rome, found themselves locked in the Vatican conclave. The heavy wooden doors closed, the keys turned, and the grand drama began in earnest. Behind those doors, the largest faction of cardinals was still French, yet a seething mass of Roman citizens, suspicious and fierce, gathered outside the papal palace. Voices rang out, "We will have a Roman pope, or at least an Italian." The threat in their words was unmissable. No one wished for bloodshed. But the people were desperate that their city should not again be abandoned in favour of the distant land across the Alps. Inside the tension was a living thing. Cardinal Orsini, determined and restless, paced in a corridor, while the French cardinals conferred. Murmurs slid through the halls. The name of Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, already known in the Curia for his administrative talents, surfaced as a compromise candidate. He was not a cardinal at the time, but he was Italian, and crucially, he seemed to have a personality that would be compliant enough for the college to guide him as they wished. None realized, in that moment, how mistaken that assumption would prove. When the white smoke at last curled into the sky over Rome, the new pope chosen by the conclave was indeed Bartolomeo Prignano, who took the name Urban VI. Outside, the Roman crowds rejoiced. A city starved of papal presence for so long believed it had at last wrested back the leadership of the universal church from French influence. But within days of his election, Urban VI began to reveal a temperament ill-suited to gentle persuasion and behind-the-scenes manipulation. The cardinals found themselves astonished by his harsh manner, his blistering reforms, and his refusal to bow to their traditions of privilege. He insisted on an austere lifestyle, condemnation of corruption, and a crackdown on simony. Moreover, he was uncompromising, even verbally abusive, in his criticism of the cardinals. In one infamous gathering, Urban VI summoned his cardinals to a closed session. Sunlight poured in dusty beams through the high windows, illuminating the gilded mosaics on the walls. Seated on a high-backed throne, the new pope surveyed them with a critical eye. The hush was absolute until Urban's gruff voice sliced through. "I find your presence here wanting," he said, directing his admonishment at a group of French cardinals who stiffened under the reproach. "I have heard rumors of lavish banquets and extravagances in Avignon. That is not the way of Christ, and it shall not be tolerated any longer. Let it be known that those who engage in the vices that have decayed the moral standing of this church will feel my full censure." A couple of the French cardinals shifted in their seats, eyes avoiding the pontiffs. Cardinal Robert of Geneva frowned slightly, measuring Urban with a critical gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, almost suffocating. It was not just a matter of differences in temperament. Urban VI was threatening the very lifeblood of their established ways, and the cardinals realized that to resist him might require drastic measures. In private corridors, a quiet plot began to form. The dissatisfaction simmered among those who had pinned their hopes on a pliable pope, only to find themselves saddled with a severe and rather bullying figure. Rumors circulated that the election had been made under duress, that the mob outside the conclave had intimidated the cardinals into choosing an Italian. The French cardinals whispered among themselves that the election might not be valid at all. One evening, as torchlight wavered along the walls of a small chapel, Cardinal Robert of Geneva met discreetly with several of his close allies. Cloaked attendants stood watch outside, ensuring privacy. Here, the scion of the noble house of Geneva spoke with quiet urgency. "Urban's tyranny cannot be allowed to continue," he murmured, voice echoing faintly off the chapel walls. "He has not only scorned our council, but has also insulted us publicly. Imagine how we appear to the kings and lords of Europe if we cannot maintain dignity within our own household. The rumor that the Roman mob forced our choice, it's not unfounded. The throng outside threatened us with death if we chose otherwise." Cardinal Jean de Lagrange, face etched with worry, nodded. "Let us be frank. We are not safe. We must consider the possibility of reassembling elsewhere, in a place more secure, to examine the validity of this election." In hushed agreement, they formed a plan. Under the pretense of seeking respite from the oppressive Roman summer heat, several of the French cardinals slipped away to Anagni. There, freed from the watchful eyes of Urban VI, they issued a formal declaration. The election in Rome had been coerced by violence, and therefore it was invalid. Urban VI, they claimed, was no true pope. They could thus freely proceed to elect another man whom they considered the rightful successor to St. Peter. Urban VI, for his part, responded with fury upon learning of the declaration. He summoned the Roman populace, reminding them of the danger posed by the French cardinals who aimed to steal the papacy back to Avignon. He railed against those he called conspirators, accusing them of sowing schism in the church. But it was too late to stop the momentum that had built against him. In August of 1378, the dissenting cardinals, reconvened in Fondi, elected Robert of Geneva as pope. He took the name Clement VII. A second papacy had begun. There were now two men claiming the throne of St. Peter. This fracturing of the Church, the Great Western Schism, would last for decades and shake Christendom to its core. Outside the walls of Fondi, a storm gathered in the hearts of the faithful. "Which pope should we recognize?" asked parish priests of their bishops. "Are we truly to pledge obedience to the man in Rome who demands so much penance and reform?" demanded some. "Or should we honor the one backed by our own lords and rulers?" Because politics, especially in that era, was deeply entwined with faith, the princes of Europe began choosing sides, their loyalties shaped by alliances, national pride, and historical enmities. France, unsurprisingly, declared itself for Clement VII in Avignon. England, always at odds with France, adhered to Urban VI in Rome. Castile and Aragon in the Iberian Peninsula had intricate negotiations, while the Holy Roman Empire gravitated toward Rome. Soon, the map of Europe was effectively split between allegiance to Rome and allegiance to Avignon, and the spiritual unity of Christendom lay in tatters. The bitterness did not confine itself to royal courts. monasteries, universities, local parishes, everywhere the faithful engaged in confused debate. Pamphlets circulated, penned by theologians who argued one side or the other. University faculties in Paris, Oxford, and Prague found themselves in heated scholarly battles over who was the rightful pontiff. Meanwhile, the concept of Christian unity, the backbone of medieval society's sense of order, fractured further with every passing year. Urban VI, increasingly paranoid about plots against him, grew more intransigent. He launched vitriolic diatribes against the schismatics and threatened excommunications left and right. Clement VII, from his seat in Avignon, built up a new curia, effectively mirroring every administrative aspect of the Roman papacy, even creating new cardinals to replace those in Urban's obedience. Both popes needed funds to support themselves, leading to increased taxes, indulgences, and financial pressures on the faithful, who chafed under the burden of supporting rival papal courts. The dynamic began to resemble two feuding kings rather than two shepherds of souls. Each insisted that the other was an impostor. Both claimed the full rights and privileges of the papal office. Across Europe, prelates and princes jockeyed for position and advantage. And the question was never purely religious, it was also about political alliances. To recognize one pope over the other was to place oneself on a particular side of international conflicts, sometimes leading to war. On a crisp autumn day in 1379, Urban VI, his tall figure hunched with stress, white robes fluttering in the breeze, stood on a balcony overlooking the Tiber. Rome, chaotic and vibrant, spread out below him. Cardinal Orsini approached from behind, kneeling respectfully. "Holy Father," Orsini began, "the reports are dire. Clement holds court in Avignon and has the ear of many French nobles, along with Scotland and parts of the Spanish kingdoms. They are shaping a narrative that you are a usurper, and there is talk of appealing to a general council to end the schism." Urban VI's face twisted. "A general council?" His voice was laced with disdain. "That is no authority above the Pope. Such a notion is an affront to the seat of St. Peter. Those who speak of it should tremble in fear of excommunication." Orsini nodded, but worry etched his features. He quietly ventured, "There are those in the College of Cardinals who think otherwise, Holy Father. They recall the era of council authority claimed in times past. They say if the Church is threatened, a council might restore unity." Urban turned, his gaze piercing. "I am the rock upon which the Church stands. There is no council above the rock." His hand gripped the balcony rail as though he might crush it. "Remember that, Cardinal." Even as Urban VI clung to the notion of absolute papal supremacy, Clement VII in Avignon also feared a general council that might jeopardize his own claims. For the moment, each pontiff found it more advantageous to wage a propaganda war than to risk a council. That meant more pamphlets, more sermons, more excommunications, and more entrenchment. The situation was dire, but for the next several years neither side budged. They reigned in parallel, each creating cardinals, conferring benefices, and dispatching legates to foreign courts. Christendom, once unified, grew accustomed to a bizarre duality in its higher spiritual leadership. The years stretched on. Urban VI died in 1389, succeeded by Boniface IX, who likewise declared himself the only legitimate pope. Clement VII died in 1394, replaced by Benedict XIII in Avignon. Still the schism persisted, the lines drawn, with no resolution in sight. The dust of confusion lay thick over Europe, and the eyes of reformers, mystics, and devout laypeople turned more and more to the idea of a general council as the only possible remedy. Scholars and theologians argued that if a pope was in error, or if two popes claimed the throne of St. Peter, the Church Universal, gathered in a council, might have the authority to settle the matter. It was an explosive idea, challenging centuries of doctrine around papal primacy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. By the early 1400s, a new generation of leaders had risen in Europe, kings, emperors, and bishops who had grown weary of the division. They saw the damage it caused in alliances, commerce, ecclesiastical appointments. More than that, piety demanded a resolution. The notion of one God, one faith, one church was fundamental, yet it was blatantly contradicted by the existence of rival popes hurling anathemas at one another. A movement began to coalesce among certain cardinals from both obediences. They floated the idea of convening a council that would either force the two popes to resign or declare one illegitimate. Cardinal Angelo Corra, the future Gregory XII in the Roman line, and others saw the writing on the wall. He recognized that the schism had become intolerable. Meanwhile, the Avignon line was equally paralyzed, with Benedict XIII losing much of his support even among the French. Many prelates believed that if the Church did not rectify the schism soon, it might face a deeper collapse of credibility. Thus, in 1409, a group of cardinals from both sides, disillusioned with the intransigence of their respective popes, gathered at the Council of Pisa. Their plan was bold. They declared that both existing popes, Gregory XII in Rome and Benedict XIII in Avignon, were heretics for refusing to end the division, and they pronounced both deposed. Then they elected a new pope, Alexander V. The idea was to unify all Christians under this new compromise pontiff. But neither Gregory XII nor Benedict XIII recognized the authority of the Council of Pisa to depose them. They each stubbornly insisted they remained the true pope. Alexander V, however, had been duly elected by a large group of cardinals who themselves held wide influence. So now, instead of two popes, the Church had three: Gregory XII in Rome, Benedict XIII in Avignon, and Alexander V, soon succeeded by John XXIII, in Pisa. This triple papacy was a humiliating spectacle, and those who had hoped Pisa might solve the crisis realized in dismay that it had only complicated the matter further. In the swirling confusion, secular rulers stepped up pressure for a definitive solution. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, an energetic and determined monarch, recognized that the schism undermined not only spiritual unity, but also his own ambitions to maintain a stable empire. Sigismund set about gathering support for another council, one that would achieve what Pisa had failed to do. He negotiated with the various claimants, and eventually the Council of Constance was convened in 1414. The city of Constance in the southern realms of the empire was soon teeming with thousands of visitors: bishops, abbots, theologians, envoys from courts across Europe, merchants, tradesmen, and even curious onlookers. Long caravans wove through the countryside, carrying delegates from as far away as England and Iberia. The roads were choked with people, the inns stuffed beyond capacity, and tents sprang up all around the city. Tensions ran high, but there was a palpable sense of hope that at last the schism might be resolved. And so the Council of Constance began under Emperor Sigismund's patronage. Representatives from each of the three obediences were present, along with countless experts, scholars, and reformers. It was the largest ecclesiastical gathering in centuries. In private chambers and public sessions, fierce debates erupted. Who had the authority to depose a pope? Did the council stand above the pontiff, or was the pope supreme? The conciliarists argued that the collective church, through its representatives gathered in council, could indeed exercise authority above a pope, especially in times of dire crisis. One day, in a private negotiation, Emperor Sigismund met with the Pisan Pope John XXIII, the successor to Alexander V, who had come to Constance hoping to consolidate his position. Sigismund, imposing in stature, clad in regal attire, fixed his gaze on John XXIII and spoke in a measured tone. "Your Holiness," he said, "the unity of the Church can only be restored if all claimants place the good of Christendom above personal ambition. I beg you to consider that should you refuse to resign, the schism will remain. Is that the legacy you wish to leave?" John XXIII looked uneasy. He was not a particularly saintly man. His reputation was tarnished by accusations of misconduct and worldliness. He knew that many in the council viewed him as no better than a usurper. The pressure to step down was enormous, but he hesitated. The papal office was a fount of power and wealth, and relinquishing it meant losing not only prestige, but also the protective mantle of the highest spiritual authority. Still, the tide at Constance was turning strongly in favor of conciliar authority. John XXIII, feeling cornered, attempted to flee the city by night in disguise. His abrupt disappearance caused an uproar. Some delegates cried out that he had proven his unworthiness to be pope. Others worried that the flight would derail the council itself. But Sigismund quickly acted to preserve order, ensuring that the council's work continued. In short order, John XXIII was captured, brought back, and forced to resign. Thus, one of the three popes was effectively removed. Gregory XII in Rome was next. A more elderly and conciliatory figure than his predecessors, Gregory recognized that the schism was untenable. He made a subtle arrangement with Sigismund and the council. He agreed to resign, but first he formally convened the Council of Constance himself to legitimize it in the eyes of those loyal to him. Then, having convened the council, he offered his resignation, effectively stepping aside for the good of the Church. The delegates, moved by his humility, accepted. His withdrawal from the papal throne in 1415 left only Benedict XIII in Avignon to contend with. Benedict XIII, an iron-willed Spaniard named Pedro de Luna, refused until the bitter end to relinquish his claim. Even as his supporters dwindled, indeed even as the King of Aragon withdrew his allegiance, Benedict XIII held fast in a fortress on the coast near Valencia. He continued to call himself Pope, excommunicating those who challenged him, but by then the council had gained the backing of every major monarch in Europe. In 1417, Benedict XIII was formally deposed by the Council of Constance. Isolated and nearing the end of his life, he retreated to a lonely rock fortress where he maintained the trappings of papal ceremony with a handful of loyal retainers. He died in 1423, never having relinquished his claim. Freed at last from the claims of multiple popes, the council proceeded to hold a conclave in Constance. From among a large group of cardinals, many newly appointed to ensure broad representation, they elected a Roman named Oddone Colonna, who took the papal name Martin V. In November of 1417, Martin V's election was announced to the jubilant city, and soon all of Christendom recognized him as the single legitimate pope. Thus ended the Western Schism nearly 40 years after it had begun. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Priests proclaimed the unity of Christendom from their pulpits. Scholars penned letters celebrating the dawn of a new era, one free of the rancor and confusion of competing papal obediences. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, lauded by many as a champion of unity, looked forward to forging a stable Europe under one recognized spiritual head. Yet even in victory, fissures remained. The Council of Constance had strengthened the idea of conciliar authority, sowing seeds for future theological and political debates. Was the Pope truly the unquestioned monarch of the Church, or did the bishops gathered in council possess supreme authority at critical junctures? This question would haunt future generations and fuel further reform movements, some moderate, some radical. The Hussites in Bohemia, for instance, saw in the council a chance to press for more sweeping reforms, and their subsequent rebellion would shake the empire to its core. Still, for the ordinary faithful, the resolution of the schism was a massive relief. At parish levels across Europe, the perplexing question of which pope to follow finally dissipated. Monasteries could return to a normal liturgical life. University faculties no longer divided themselves into Roman or Avignon factions. Indeed, though the Church would face many more challenges in the coming centuries, the Great Western Schism would stand as one of the darkest chapters of disunity ever experienced. Its closure, a vital step toward preserving Catholicism's sense of oneness, at least for a time, in the pre-Reformation world. And so the story of the Western Schism can be heard in the echo of footsteps, in deserted corridors at Avignon, in the fiery speeches of Urban VI within the walls of Rome, in the clandestine gatherings of cardinals seeking a new pope at Fondi, in the confusion of Pisan bishops wringing their hands, and at long last in the triumphant tolling of bells at Constance, where Martin V was hailed as the single shepherd of the Christian flock. To fully grasp the drama that led three men to claim the throne of St. Peter between 1378 and 1417, one must understand the tangled web of alliances, national pride, personal ambitions, and genuine religious convictions that shaped the era. The Avignon papacy had laid the groundwork for distrust. The Roman populace demanded an Italian pope. The French cardinals sought to preserve their influence. The new pope, Urban VI, bristled with righteous fury and alienated those who had elected him. The disaffected cardinals made their own pope, Clement VII, leading to a fractured church. Kings and princes fanned the flames by recognizing whichever pope best served their political interests. And when the schism became too entrenched for either side to bow gracefully, the novel assertion of conciliar supremacy emerged. leading to Pisa, to a humiliating triple papacy, and finally to Constance, where a definitive council hammered out unity, albeit with lingering aftershocks. In the end, the Western Schism was resolved, but not without undermining the unquestioned spiritual authority of the papacy in the minds of many believers. The spectacle of popes cursing each other and councils deposing popes shattered illusions of an unassailable spiritual monarchy. It revealed the deeply human political undercurrents that surged beneath the divine claims of the papal office. The resolution at Constance was less a triumph of papal power and more a testament to the will of the collective church, guided by an emperor and a host of exasperated cardinals, bishops, and laity. Nevertheless, a measure of peace returned, and Martin V marched triumphantly into Rome, greeted by cheering crowds. Processions, solemn masses, and festive banquets celebrated the restoration of one pope. The city, once more the undisputed seat of the papacy, felt alive with possibility. Diplomatic envoys arrived from every corner of Europe to pay homage to the single pontiff, forging new alliances in the fresh breeze of post-schism unity. Meanwhile, in the dusty archives of monasteries and cathedrals, scribes penned accounts of the schism, sometimes lamenting the scandal that had befallen Christendom, sometimes praising God for its conclusion. And so the faithful carried on. Priests baptized, heard confessions, and celebrated the Eucharist under the name of Martin V, the one true pope. In distant corners of Europe, simpler folk, who had long been confused by the contradictory commands of rival papal claimants, found solace in a renewed sense of unity. They might never fully understand the labyrinth of politics and personalities that had caused the Church to break apart. But for them the important thing was that the schism was over, the scandal resolved, and the Bride of Christ once again carried herself under a single earthly head, however flawed and human he might be. History would remember Bartolomeo Prignano, Urban VI, as the spark that lit the conflagration. Historians would debate whether the Roman mob truly forced the cardinals to elect him, or whether that was a convenient excuse for the French cardinals to reject him later. Clement VII's real name, Robert of Geneva, would resonate with the memory of an ambitious nobleman whose involvement in a brutal massacre at Cesena during the War of the Eight Saints revealed a certain ruthlessness. Benedict XIII, the last Avignon claimant, would be depicted as a lonely holdout in a coastal fortress, excommunicating the world even as the world abandoned him. Gregory XII would earn a degree of respect for his willingness to step down for the greater good, and John XXIII, deposed at Constance, would remain a cautionary tale about scandalous popes. But the final chapter belonged to Martin V, the man of compromise and diplomacy whose election ended 4 decades of chaos. Some decades later, in a monastery near the Swiss Alps, a young monk studying ancient parchments might come across a letter written by a cardinal at Constance. By the flickering candlelight, he would read lines praising Emperor Sigismund's role, cursing the obstinacy of Benedict XIII, and celebrating the moment Martin V was announced as Pope. He might pause, reflect on the complexities of ecclesiastical governance, and marvel that such a crisis had ever arisen. Yet he would also see the seeds of a broader transformation in the Church. The rise of conciliar theory, the impetus for reform, the recognition of political powers in ecclesiastical matters. The Western Schism, though ended, had left its mark on the collective psyche of Europe. In that same monastery, a venerable abbot might recall the visits of 2 different sets of papal collectors during the schism, one representing Avignon, the other Rome, both demanding contributions for their respective popes. He would remember the confusion of the novices, who heard conflicting instructions about which pope's name should be invoked at Mass. He would also remember the relief when, at last, only one name was needed, Martin V, and the abbot, with a tired smile, might remark to his young monks, "The Church endures by God's grace, but men's pride and politics will ever threaten unity unless humility prevails." That memory, handed down through generations, testifies to the sociological and spiritual crisis the Western Schism unleashed. Communities that had once taken comfort in the unifying presence of a single pontiff found themselves confronted with the messy reality of contested authority. The devout laity questioned not only which pope was legitimate, but sometimes even questioned the entire institution. Some turned to local mystics or ascetics, hoping to find simpler, purer forms of devotion, untainted by the spectacle of ecclesiastical wrangling. Others doubled down on loyalty to whichever pope their local bishop followed, creating pockets of intense partisanship. Monks and nuns prayed fervently for a resolution, while unscrupulous figures profited from the confusion. It was, in short, a crisis not just of leadership but of identity. And identity is a fragile thing, both for individuals and for a vast institution like the Church. The schism forced the Church to confront that fragility. Was its unity a mystical bond forged by God's will, or was it subject to the same earthly struggles that plagued secular governments? The resolution at Constance did not erase the memory of those harrowing years, nor did it eliminate the yearning for deeper reform. In the following century, the Renaissance popes, more focused on art and politics, would prompt further criticism, eventually paving the way for the Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century. In that sense, the Western Schism foreshadowed both the Church's capacity for survival and its vulnerability to division. Yet for all that, the end of the Western Schism in 1417 was a genuine triumph of collective determination and negotiation. Councils, emperors, cardinals, theologians, and laity worked together, albeit often contentiously, to bring about a single occupant of the chair of St. Peter. The memory of that successful resolution lingered, reminding future generations that even the direst crises of unity might be overcome when the Church's leaders placed the greater good above personal ambition. And so, with Martin V's solemn entry into Rome and the final disappearance of Benedict XIII's threadbare court, the era of three popes drew to a close. The bishops of Europe returned home, carrying news of the council's decisions. They found that their flocks hungered for a church that would stand firmly without fracture to guide them through the moral and spiritual uncertainties of life. It was a tall order, but at least they had a single pope once more, one man to whom all Latin Christendom could look for leadership, even if he too was fallible and shaped by the politics of his day. In taverns, along dusty roads, in the halls of castles, and in the marketplaces of cities, the faithful and the curious alike murmured about the schism that had seemed interminable, now finally ended. They spoke of the dramatic scenes in Rome, Avignon, Pisa, and Constance, as though recounting epic battles or the lives of saints and sinners. Mothers soothed their children with the comforting news that the Church was made whole again. Travelling minstrels wove songs that hinted at the folly of pride and ambition. And somewhere, in a quiet cell illuminated by a single lantern, a scribe wrote the last few words of a chronicle, closing the chapter on one of the most surreal, devastating, and instructive episodes in the long history of the Church. These things we have seen, and these are the trials of our time. 3 men once claimed the throne of St. Peter. Pride and fear and politics all played their part, yet the Church has found its unity again. May God grant that such a rupture never come to pass once more. He set down his quill, sanded the parchment, and breathed a tired sigh. Then he rose, walked toward the monastery chapel, and prayed that the lessons of the schism would guide the Church toward humility and harmony. Unbeknownst to him, and to all those who witnessed the Great Western Schism, this episode would remain a vivid testament to both the fragility and the resilience of human institutions, even those believed to be divinely ordained. In the centuries to follow, historians and theologians alike would sift through documents, letters, edicts, and transcripts from the councils. They would debate the nuance of papal supremacy versus conciliar authority. They would examine the interplay of secular power and ecclesiastical leadership. They would marvel at how close Christendom came to irreparable fracture and how, in a moment of shared desperation, it managed to find a new equilibrium. The canon lawyers, especially, would pass every decree of Constance, dissecting the language that hinted at a council's right to depose a pope under extraordinary circumstances. Meanwhile, the memory of those years would loom large, a cautionary tale for every bishop who let worldly ambition overshadow spiritual duty, for every monarch who meddled in church affairs for temporal gain, for every pope who forgot that his office was meant to serve the unity of the faithful. The Western Schism would stand as an unsettling reminder that even the highest seat in Christendom was not immune to the storms of human strife. Yet in the end it is perhaps more than just a cautionary tale. It is a story of a church that, despite its failings and the flawed men who led it, found the means to heal a deep wound. The reconciliation at Constance showed that dialogue, broad participation, and the impetus of devout leaders, even from the secular realm, could bring resolution to a seemingly impossible conflict. In that sense, the Western Schism's resolution stands as an early example of an institution grappling with internal division and emerging, if not unscathed, at least intact and prepared to move forward. Thus, the reasons behind this tumultuous development, from 1378 to 1417, 3 men at once claiming to be the true pope, were manifold. The Avignon papacy sowed suspicion toward French-dominated popes, creating pressure to elect an Italian in 1378. Urban VI's harsh reforms alienated the cardinals who had chosen him, prompting them to declare his election invalid. Political alliances split Europe into factions that supported either the Roman Pope or the Avignon Pope, further perpetuating the schism. Attempts at resolution, such as the Council of Pisa in 1409, only exacerbated matters by introducing a third pope. Finally, it was the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, supported by Emperor Sigismund and a broad swath of clergy and theologians, that compelled the popes to resign or be deposed. The election of Martin V in 1417 signalled the restoration of a single papacy, thus bringing an end to one of the most dramatic sagas in church history. And so, as the bells pealed across the hills of Constance, echoing over the placid waters of the lake, the faithful there gathered to celebrate a new unity. In the winding streets of the city, where countless pilgrims had mingled with merchants and scholars, a joyous procession formed, headed by priests bearing incense and chanting hymns of praise. The man they now hailed as Pope Martin V rode in a simple carriage, his countenance humble yet dignified. Garlands of flowers adorned the path, and onlookers wept with relief. Europe had its single pontiff once more, and though the weight of the schism's wounds could not be washed away in a single day, the healing had begun. In the hush of that moment, an ancient cardinal, stooped with age and carrying scars of many battles, spiritual and political, whispered into Sigismund's ear, "Sire, Christendom shall remember this council. May it never forget what happens when pride overtakes piety, when ambition eclipses unity." Sigismund nodded solemnly, his gaze fixed on the figure of Martin V, now blessing the crowd with outstretched arms. In that shared silence, beneath the bright sky of Constance, they both hoped that Europe had learned a lesson about the perils of division, the futility of unbridled ambition, and the dire cost of letting political intrigues swallow spiritual responsibility. Yet human memory is often shorter than we think. The immediate crisis was over, but the future held new storms. Nevertheless, for that particular day, the faithful of Constance, and indeed all of Christendom, rejoiced that at last, after nearly 40 long years, there was once again only one successor to St. Peter. People bowed their heads in prayer, gave thanks to the Almighty, and returned to their homelands bearing tidings of unity renewed. Thus ends the saga of how, from 1378 to 1417, 3 men simultaneously claimed to be the true pope during the Western Schism, and how the Church at last untangled itself from that harrowing snare. It is a testament to the complexity and the resilience of medieval society, a drama replete with personal rivalries, political maneuverings, deep-seated fears, and fervent hopes. It left an indelible mark on the Catholic Church, reshaping perceptions of authority and igniting discussions that would lead, over time, to both Renaissance grandeur and Reformation turmoil. It demonstrated that while the papacy might claim an unbroken divine mandate from St. Peter, it was still subject to the passions and failings of mere mortals. And in its conclusion, it proved that God's people in times of dire crisis could yet rally to restore the unity of their faith, even if the path to that unity was fraught with struggle, compromise, and no small measure of human drama.